A Nigerian man was crowned in South Africa, and suddenly shops were attacked, foreigners were threatened, students were chased, businesses were destroyed, and people started shouting,
"Foreigners must go."
But let me tell you the truth, this was never really about one man. It was never really about one crown, and it was never really about one Igbo title, because if one ceremony can cause this much anger, then the anger was already there. The Igbo King story was only the spark. The real fire is much older. It is older than social media, older than Operation Dudula, older than this protest, older than this one ceremony. It goes back to colonial borders. It goes back to apartheid. It goes back to broken African leadership. It goes back to a system that taught Africans to fear each other while protecting the real structures that made them poor. So no, this is not just the story of a Nigerian crowned in South Africa. This is the story of how Africa was divided, how Africans were turned against Africans, and how one cultural ceremony became a political bobiem in a wounded continent. I'm the story man, and here's the story behind the headline. Let's start with the event itself. Videos started circulating online showing a Nigerian community leader in South Africa being ceremonially installed with the title Igwe Ndigbo na East London. To many Igbo people, that title sounds normal because Igwe is a respected traditional title in Igbo culture. It can refer to a king, a leader, a custodian of culture, or a symbolic head of a people. So from the Nigerian side, many people saw it as a cultural event, a community title, or a way of honoring a leader of the Igbo community in South Africa. But in South Africa, many people saw something very different. They did not see an internal cultural event. They saw a foreigner is being crowned king on South African soil. And that changed everything, because in South Africa, traditional leadership is not a joke. It is tied to land. It is tied to identity. It is tied to law. It is tied to sovereignty. It is tied to history. So once people saw crowns, regalia, ceremony, and the language of kingship, many interpreted it as a direct insult, not because that may have been the intention, but because that is how it looked. And in politics, optics can be more dangerous than intention. That is why the story exploded. But again, that was only the spark. Now ask yourself a simple question. If this was only one ceremony, why did it create so much rage? Why were people attacking shops? Why were foreigners being threatened? Why were Nigerian-owned businesses being targeted? Why were students and migrants being made to feel unsafe? Because the truth is this, people do not react like that unless there is already deep anger underneath. And in South Africa, that anger has been growing for years. For a long time, many poor South Africans have been living with high unemployment, crime, failing public services, housing pressure, political corruption, and deep frustration with government failure. And when governments fail for too long, people start looking for someone to blame. Instead of blaming the corrupt system, the political elite, the broken economy, the legacy of apartheid, the unfinished struggle after white rule, many people are pushed to blame foreigners, Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, Somalis, Ethiopians, Pakistanis, anyone who is seen as not from here. That is how scapegoating works. When leaders cannot solve the real problem, they give the people a weaker target. And once that happens, anger moves downward, not upward. It attacks the vulnerable, not the powerful. That is why a cultural ceremony became a violent controversy, because the wound was already there. If you want to understand this story, you must understand one name, Operation Dudula. This is one of the most visible anti-migrant movements in South Africa, and their message is simple. Foreigners are the problem. They say foreigners are taking jobs. They say foreigners bring crime. They say foreigners overload public services. They say foreigners must be removed. But here is the hard truth. That story is emotionally powerful, but it is also dangerously incomplete, because South Africa's real crisis did not begin with Nigerians. It did not begin with Zimbabweans. It did not begin with Somali shop owners. It did not begin with foreign students. South Africa's crisis is rooted in colonial theft, apartheid land dispossession, economic inequality, elite corruption, youth unemployment, broken institutions, and a post-apartheid promise that was never fully delivered. And when those problems remain, foreigners become the easy target. That is why anti-migrant groups can grow, because pain without direction becomes anger, and anger without truth becomes xenophobia. That is the real danger. Now let's go deeper, because this is the part many Africans were never properly taught. Africa did not just inherit borders, Africa inherited division. Colonial powers did not build African states to unite Africans. They built territories to extract wealth. They drew borders while ask in my who are these people? What histories do they share? What tensions already exist? What future conflicts are we planting? They split ethnic groups across borders. They forced rival groups into one state. They created artificial countries. They elevated some groups. They weakened others. They rewarded collaborators. They built divide and rule systems. Then they left. But they did not leave behind strong institutions, fair economies, healed societies, or equal development. They left behind fragmented nations, competing identities, unequal access, and political systems designed to control, not empower. So when Africans today fight each other, many times they are acting inside a house they did not build. A house designed to create tension, a house designed to make unity difficult, a house designed so that power stays unstable and instability remains profitable. That is why I say the Igbo King story is not the real story. The real story is a continent still living inside colonial architecture. Now, let's talk about South Africa specifically, because South Africa is not just any African country. It went through one of the most brutal racial systems in modern history, apartheid. Under apartheid, black South Africans were dispossessed, controlled, segregated, economically crushed, pushed to the margins. Then apartheid officially ended. But here is the painful truth. Political freedom came, but economic justice did not fully follow. Yes, black South Africans gained rights. Yes, apartheid laws ended. Yes, there was a democratic transition, but millions of people were still left in poverty, unemployment, poor housing, weak services, and deep inequality. And that creates a dangerous emotional condition. Because when people are told, you are now free, but their daily life still feels like struggle, frustration grows, and when that frustration is not transformed into structural reform, it gets redirected. That is where foreigners become the substitute enemy. Instead of asking, why is land still unequal? Why is wealth still concentrated? Why is youth unemployment so high? Why are services failing? Why are leaders corrupt? People are told, the foreigners are taking what belongs to you. That is how broken systems survive. They redirect anger away from the architects of failure. Now, let's be honest. Why are Nigerians often singled out? This part is sensitive, but it must be said clearly. Nigerians are highly visible in many African countries. They are visible in business, entertainment, trade, churches, student communities, social life, diaspora networks, and entrepreneurship. That visibility can create admiration, but in tense societies, it can also create resentment, especially when locals are already angry, insecure, or struggling. Then stereotypes begin. Nigerians are arrogant. Nigerians control too much. Nigerians do crime. Nigerians are taking over. This is how prejudice grows. A few stories become a whole identity. A few criminals become an entire nationality. A few visible successes become proof of invasion. That is not justice. That is scapegoating. And once social media joins the fire, the lies spread faster than facts. That is exactly what happened here. Many people online did not hear Igbo community title. They heard a Nigerian became king in South Africa. That wording was explosive, and in a climate already full of anti-foreigner anger, it became a weapon. Now let me be brutally honest. Was the ceremony illegal in the way social media said? Probably not in the dramatic way people claimed. Was it likely a cultural or diaspora community event? Yes, that is what many reports suggest. But was it politically wise? No, absolutely not. And this is where I will not lie to you. In a country already tense about immigration, already suspicious of foreigners, already sensitive about kingship, land, and traditional authority, holding a public ceremony with royal language, crowns, and Igwe symbolism was politically tone deaf. It may have been innocent in intention, but in that climate, it was almost guaranteed to be misunderstood. That does not justify violence. That does not justify looting. That does not justify attacking students. That does not justify destroying shops. That does not justify threatening Nigerians. But truth must be balanced. The violence was wrong, and the optics of the event were also careless. Both things can be true. Now here is the part that should break every African heart. While Africans are busy chasing Africans, the deeper system remains untouched. While South Africans attack Nigerians, the structures of inequality remain. While Nigerians insult South Africans online, the continent remains economically dependent. While people burn foreign-owned shops, global capital continues. While students are chased from schools, the same political elites stay protected. This is the tragedy. Africa is often taught to fight sideways, not upward. We fight tribe against tribe, country against country, foreigner against local, Igbo against South African, Nigerian against Zimbabwean, West African against Southern African. Meanwhile, the elites eat, the system survives, the inequality remains, the infrastructure decays, and the future is delayed. That is why this story matters, because it is not just about South Africa. It is about a larger African condition. A continent rich in people, but divided in mind. A continent wounded by history, and then taught to blame itself in the wrong direction. So, what is the truth they never told us? Here it is. The problem is not that Africans are naturally divided. The problem is that Africa was engineered for division, then ruled through division, then abandoned in division, and many post-colonial leaders continue to benefit from that same division. That is the truth. Colonialism did not just steal land. It trained psychology. It built hierarchy. It rewarded imitation. It planted suspicion. It fractured identity. It taught Africans to compete for scarcity inside broken systems. And after independence, too many African elites inherited the same playbook. So today, when a Nigerian title in South Africa becomes a crisis, what you are seeing is not just one controversy. You are watching history, trauma, poverty, politics, identity, and manipulation collide in public. That is the real story. So no, the Igbo King was never the real reason. He was the spark, not the fire. The fire was already there, built by colonial borders, deepened by apartheid, protected by corruption, fed by unemployment, weaponized by politics, and directed at the wrong people. That is why shops were attacked. That is why foreigners were threatened. That is why students felt unsafe. That is why one ceremony became a national outrage, because the continent is still carrying old wounds inside new headlines. And until Africans stop turning their pain against each other, the real architects of the problem will keep winning. I'm the story man, and the headline is new, but the wound is old.